Many atheists have a story about how they came to reject belief in God. I have always been an atheist. I have never believed in God, so I don't have any story about that. But when I was a kid, I believed in good and evil. I believed that there was something called good and something called evil, and that I should try to do good and not evil. But I didn't consciously, explicitly believe that. I just assumed it. When I was about 9 years old, I started to question that assumption. And I'm going to tell the story of how that happened and how I eventually came to reject the idea of good and evil. At the time, I was living in an apartment complex in a small town in the interior of British Columbia. The apartment complex was at the edge of town, and behind it there were hills covered in bunchgrass, sagebrush, and ponderosa pines. The hills were broken in places by cliffs and patches of bare rock. It is dry, open country. And whenever I think back to those days, I think about climbing up cliffs with little bits of dry moss and cactus growing in the cracks, and roaming in hills above where there was grass and sagebrush, and not a lot else. In that place, in those days, kids pretty much ran wild. There was very little parental supervision. So, especially in the summer, we just ran wild with dirty tanned faces and hair bleached by the sun. We rode our little bikes around, explored the hills, played hide and seek, had fistfights, had crushes on each other, and basically did all the things that kids do when they are left to their own devices. In the summer, there were lots of grasshoppers. They would lay their eggs in cracks in the pavement of the roads, because the eggs are relatively safe in those cracks, and the heat makes them hatch faster. I used to kneel on the road, watching these creatures pump out their eggs. They would not try to escape, they would just sit there. Once a female grasshopper is committed to laying her eggs, she stays there until the job is done, or she is killed. From a very early age, I had been fascinated by nature. I would spend hours in the hills, collecting rocks and looking at plants and animals. I found those grasshoppers interesting for their own sake. But the rest of the kids in the apartment complex made a game out of running over the grasshoppers with their bikes, leaving behind a trail of little squashed bodies with twitching limbs. They liked to kill them. This really bothered me. I was not averse to killing. I sometimes fished and hunted. I did not enjoy killing, but I wasn't opposed to it either. I viewed killing as part of life, but not as a form of amusement. What bothered me about what those kids were doing is that they were killing the grasshoppers out of sheer cruelty, as a game. I thought that was wrong. I asked them why they did it, and they gave me different answers. Some said, grasshoppers are bad. They're bad for the farmers. Some said, they're just grasshoppers, so who cares? Some said, I don't know. It's fun. They did not view grasshoppers as worthy of consideration or concern, but it was clear that they did not view them as objects either, like pebbles. It would not have been nearly as much fun to run over pebbles. What made the game fun is that grasshoppers are alive. They can be hurt. They can be killed. I wondered why I thought it was wrong and they didn't. I realized that I didn't have a good justification for my belief either. I had different feelings about it than the other kids, but I couldn't justify my feelings any more than they could. I didn't know what those feelings were based on. The grasshopper killing game made me think about good and evil. It also made me aware that people enjoy cruelty at least as much as kindness. People are not nice. And I knew that I was not exempt from that. I did not want to kill the grasshoppers, but at some level I could understand that cruelty can feel good. It gives you a feeling of power. Crushing an enemy, even a pretend enemy, feels good. Humans are, after all, both warriors and predators. Fall came, and the grasshoppers were gone. I often thought about the problem of good and evil when I was walking to school. I didn't think about it all the time, but every now and then I mulled it over. Why do some people think one thing is good, and others think something different is good? I didn't have any solution. I just kept thinking about it. What is good and evil? Winter came and went. In the spring, a baby robin fell out of a nest in a nearby tree, and the kids in the neighborhood brought it to me because they knew I liked animals. I guess their impulse for kindness on that occasion was greater than their impulse for cruelty. Or maybe they found a baby bird easier to positively identify with. Whatever the reason, they brought me this baby bird. I made a nest for it in a shoebox lined with an old t-shirt, and I fed it sugar water with an eyedropper and little bits of meat. The bird survived and started to grow, and pretty soon I had to find another food source for it. So I went out hunting worms. This bothered me. I knew that worms are living beings. They might not have the same kind of feelings that we do, and they might not even have feelings at all, but they clearly want, in some sense, to live. They have their own little thing going on. They seek out food and avoid predators. The bird also clearly wanted to live. Every day I had to feed it worms. I wondered, was it good or bad to save the bird? Is a worm's life worth less than a bird's life? What about 100 worms? How do you compare two different kinds of life? Was I doing bad or good? All I knew is that I was doing good for the bird and bad for the worms. I thought about it some more, and I realized it is actually more complicated than that. I was doing good for some worms and bad for others. Good for one bird and bad for others. The bird would grow up to eat other worms. That is bad for the worms it will eat. The bird will grow up to compete with other birds. That is bad for the birds it will compete with. I knew that worms compete as well. By killing some worms, I was helping others. From my time spent observing nature, I knew that life is competitive. I reasoned that any good I did for one living being would be balanced out by harm done to others, and vice versa. It is impossible to know all the effects of an action, but it is possible to know that the net effect on life will be zero, based on the conservation of energy. You can shuffle energy around from one life form to another, but the amount of energy entering the ecosystem from the sun doesn't change. That's when I first understood the zero-sum nature of life. In any ecosystem, there is a finite amount of energy that can be used by life, and life tends to use all available energy. Thus, helping or harming one living being does not affect the total amount of life. It just shuffles energy around. Life is a competition for the energy of the environment. I also thought about why we do things. I saved that bird because it made me feel good, because I liked it. We are always driven by our desires, our feelings of pain and pleasure. How can any act be unselfish if it is driven by my own desires? After dinner, I would often walk across the highway to a little hill, an outcrop of rock from an old lava flow, climb up the dusty scree full of broken beer bottles, climb up the lichen-covered basalt, and sit on a little rock ledge. One day I was sitting there thinking this. Suppose I was standing above a cliff, and a guy was hanging by his fingertips from the edge of the cliff. Should I give him a hand up? Or should I let him fall? The conventional answer is that you help the guy up. That is the good thing to do. But why? The man could be a serial killer. He could be a cancer researcher. He could be all kinds of things. If he lives, that will have consequences that are good for some and bad for others. If he dies, that will have consequences that are good for some and bad for others. Either way, summed over everyone, those consequences will cancel out. Suppose I chose to help him because he is my friend. In that case, it would be selfish from my perspective. I would be saving him for the sake of our friendship, which has value to me. Or I might save him because I want to be a hero, or because he might be grateful. Again, that would be selfish. Should I save him because he is human, like me? If that were true, then it would still be selfish at the level of the species. I would be putting my species ahead of others. But since humans are competitors in nature, it is unlikely that I would want to rescue another human being merely because of our common humanity. Humans fight wars all the time. For me to help him, there would have to be some benefit to me as an individual. It might be to get praise or approval, to make a new friend, to get a reward, or to avoid a punishment. Those reasons are all selfish. They are based on what I want, not on some external, objective standard of value. Any reason I could have for helping him would ultimately be selfish. I looked across the highway, past the apartment complex, past the brown hills, and into the blue sky. Everything I do is selfish. It could never be any other way. Good and evil are illusions. And that is how I became amoral.